to Jesus now, holding nothing back, holding nothing back. Oh, to Jesus now, oh, to Jesus now. Here I am. Here I am, Lord, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. And here I am, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. The wonder of how you brought deliverance, the exodus of my heart. You found me, you freed me, held back the waters for my release. Oh Yahweh, you're the God who fights for me, Lord of every victory. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You have torn apart the sea, you have led me through the deep. Hallelujah, hallelujah. By day is a sign that you are with me. The fire by night is the guiding light to my feet. You found me, you freed me, held back the waters for my release. Oh Yahweh, you're the God who fights for me, Lord of every victory. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You have torn apart the sea, you have led me through the deep. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You're the God who fights for me, Lord of every victory. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You have torn apart the sea, you have led me through the deep. Hallelujah, hallelujah. As you stepped into my Egypt, and you took me by the hand, and you marched me out in freedom. into the promised land. And now I will not forget you, God. I'll sing of all you've done. Death is swallowed up forever by the fury of your love. As you stepped into my Egypt, and you took me by the hand, and you marched me out in freedom into the promised land. Now I will not forget you, God. I'll sing of all you've done. Death is swallowed up forever by the fury of your love. You're the God who fights for me, Lord of every victory. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You have torn apart the sea, you have led me through the deep. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You're the God who fights for me, Lord of every victory. Hallelujah, hallelujah. You have torn apart the sea, you have led me through the deep. Hallelujah,
Thanks for joining us today online. Just wanted you to know that probably for the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be doing online services before we can get back on site. That's just for the foreseeable future. Don't forget, you can always, as you're joining us online, invite someone along. Just text them, send them a message saying, hey, our church is having a service right now. You might get something out of it. It might bless you and help you in some way. And also, you can have your prayer requests being prayed for right then by some of our team. Also, just when it comes to giving, so many of you have been giving online to support the ministry we do locally and around the world, and we just want to thank you for that. It really does make a difference. And in fact, last month, we actually made our budget, which is a great, wonderful thing. It doesn't always happen, so thank you for taking giving to God's kingdom seriously. It's very, very helpful. And so, yeah, we'll just keep on serving and just keep praying that the lockdown will end soon and that we'll be back to normal. That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, so let's just pray. God, we just thank you that you love us so much and that you've given us this technology, that we can still come together in some capacity, that we can not only hear your word together and worship together, God, but then we can actually connect through things like Zoom and other medias. God, we just thank you that we're not alone during this time. And most importantly, that we have your Spirit and you're present with us, always available 24/7. Even if we're awake and can't sleep at 2 in the morning, you're there with us. So God, we thank you for that. And we do just ask your help in the midst of this time. Please give our government officials wisdom and help them to make the right decisions. And please give people in our community wisdom to make the right decisions as well, so that this pandemic can pass quickly. So we just thank you for all that you're doing in our midst. In Jesus' name, amen.
Only for the moments where I'm still in your presence, all noise dies down. Lord, speak to me now. You have all my attention. I will linger and listen. I can't miss a thing. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. All I want is to live within your love, be undone by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper. Lord, I will open up again, throw my fears there's no hesitation in your love and affection. It's the sweetest of all. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. Is to live within your love.
Today's Bible reading is from Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 10. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, to be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, so that these satraps would be accountable to them, and that the king would not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel regarding government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, because he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God." Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: "King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who offers a prayer to any god or person besides you, O king, for 30 days, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it will not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Thereupon King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Now when Daniel learned that the document was signed, he entered his house, and in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and offering praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously.
Well, good morning. Welcome to church. We're delighted that you're here with us. Let me ask you a question. Do you think authenticity is a good thing? I've been thinking about this over the course of the last week, and do you think authenticity, particularly authenticity alone, is a good thing? I've considered, on balance, you'd have to say it's a good thing. It's certainly better than someone being false, or somebody being inauthentic, or somebody being a hypocrite. So in that sense, being authentic is a good thing, correct? And yet, what exactly is authenticity? It could be defined this way: it's being true to one's personality, spirit, or character. And so for someone to be authentic is a way of saying they're going to be real. What you see on the outside, the way that they act on the outside, is consistent with what's actually going on the inside. What they think, what they feel, is actually represented in the way in which they act. That's what it means to be authentic. And yet the question is that the only thing? Is it the most important thing? In Daniel chapter 6, we have a group of characters that are acting very, very authentically. They're very, very real. They're true to who they are. What they think and what they feel is reflected in the way in which they act. And we get their story. It starts at the beginning of Daniel chapter 6. Daniel 6 verses 1 to 4. We're told it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. And so you have this group of people, these satraps, and they're being real. They're being authentic. They honestly feel jealous toward Daniel. And so their actions reflect the fact that they feel that way. They're an example of authenticity. You ever had somebody that's being real or just honest with you, and yet their way of being honest or real is just to critique or criticize everybody around them, and they leave this trail of carnage, but hey, I was just being real? In fact, I think some of the most authentic people you'll ever find are in prison. After all, they are acting in a way which is consistent with what they felt or thought at a particular point in time. And see, that's a challenge with authenticity. It's something we don't necessarily like to acknowledge, or we don't necessarily want to talk about. But the challenge of authenticity is this: what's inside of us is sometimes darker and uglier than we care to admit. And that we don't like to think about this. And ironically, in trying to be honest or being real, sometimes we're not real with ourselves. The honest conversations with ourselves is sometimes my character or my spirit isn't all that it ought to be. Sometimes it's uglier, sometimes it's darker. It's certainly far from being someone who is created exclusively in the image of God, completely in the image of God. Sometimes the reality is our thought life, our inner life is far from that which is consistent with someone who is pursuing the things of God. And so that's an ugly side of authenticity. It's a dark side of authenticity. And I wonder if what our world needs more than people with authenticity, although it certainly needs that, it needs people with integrity. And so today I'm going to look at Daniel, because I think Daniel is someone who exhibits integrity. And as we watch him, particularly in chapter 6, but really throughout his entire life, we see someone who demonstrates both the nature of integrity and also the power of integrity. Integrity can be defined this way. It's firm adherence to a code of especially moral or artistic values. It's an unimpaired condition. It's a quality or state of being complete or undivided. You see, integrity is more than just having a consistency of your inner thoughts and your outer behavior, although it's certainly that. As the definition sort of highlights, integrity is actually adherence to a core set of beliefs or values or a faith that actually invites you to be better, to live differently, to not just succumb to being, I'm going to be real to my flawed, ugly nature, but I'm actually going to pursue to be something that is more integrated, more whole, more complete, where I can actually act better and be better. That is a life of integrity. Erwin McManus, in his book Uprising, makes this observation about integrity. He says, integrity is not just about who you are, but who you seek to become. When we have integrity, we don't need to pretend. We are well aware of our weaknesses and shortcomings. Integrity is not about being flawless, but being falseless. When you watch a person of integrity, you know exactly what's inside him or her. I love that line where he says, integrity is not just about who you are, but who you seek to become. You see, none of us are perfect. We have limitations, we make mistakes, we have flaws, we have cracks. And God looks at you and me and says, I can see you, what you could be if you just succumb to submit yourself or surrender yourself to being a person in my image, if you just give yourself to this life that I call you to live. And there are moments that come along in life that reveal to us just really what the state of our heart is, the depth of our conviction. And in Daniel chapter 6, we have one such moment. The whole context has changed in Daniel 6 from the previous chapters. Remember in Daniel chapter 1, we had the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and he carried right through to Daniel chapter 4. We get to Daniel chapter 5, we have another Babylonian king, Belshazzar. But then by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, we have a completely new king, Darius, and not just a new king, but a new empire. It's no longer the Babylonians, it's the Persians that are in power. And what happens is the new regime comes in, the new empire comes in, there's a reshuffling of the deck. And people are jockeying for positions. There's an opportunity to make a name for yourself, to get ahead, to get one of these new positions. And so the question is, how will those people in power respond? Now here's the scene that we read just a moment ago. This is what happens. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now these satraps have significant responsibility. If you're a satrap, it means you oversaw, or you're a governor over, say, 20 to 30 different provinces. It's significant responsibility. It's a position of trust given to you by the king. You had to collect the tribute on behalf of the king. You would maintain security in the region. The king was saying, I trust you with a significant portion of my kingdom to oversee it. And what it seems is that not all the satraps were worthy of that trust. They would turn the other way. They would line their pockets. They would leverage their position for personal gain or personal advantage. And then we have Daniel the exile, and he's one of those, but he's not like everybody else. He doesn't take a bribe. He doesn't look the other way. He's done so well and he's so, his character is so worthy of respect that the king says, you, of all these, I want to make the chief of my satraps. Daniel is a success, and because of that, he gets the attention of everybody around him. He experiences what Australians actually have a name for, the tall poppy syndrome. He's had a modicum of success, and so people want to tear him down. And so Daniel the exile is under attack because of his success. And here's how the story unfolds, verses 4 to 5. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for changes against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. What's their assessment of him? They look at him and say, we're trying to find something. The problem is he's trustworthy, and the problem is he's not corrupt. The problem is that he's not even a slacker. He's not even negligent in his responsibility. Like he works hard and he's trustworthy, and we can't corrupt him, and that's a problem with this guy. Satraps are supposed to abuse their positions. They're meant to line their pockets. They're meant to look the other way. They're meant to take the bribe. But Daniel does none of that. And it's all too rare in public life. And Daniel has forged a reputation that is undeniable. But it's also a reminder for us that the life of integrity, irrespective of your position, irrespective of your context, is possible. That the life of integrity is possible. And so how do they react? Verses 6 to 10. So the administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, O king, Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And the trap is set. Now, a bit of background about Persian kings. Persian kings did not think they were divine. They didn't see themselves as gods or demigods, maybe at best someone worthy of respect. You'd never come into the context or the environment of a king casually. They're held in esteem, they had high respect. At best, maybe something between a mediator between humanity and divine would maybe be the way in which you'd see a king. And so when these leaders come to the king with this request, it's an unusual request. That we want to worship you and worship you only for 30 days and don't let anybody worship anything else. It's an unusual request, but it flatters the king, so much so that the king agrees. And he agrees not just to the request to have people worship him for 30 days and nothing else, but he also agrees to the decree that anybody who does not worship him will be thrown into a lion's den, which is effectively a pit with a hole at the top in which you lower somebody in. And there'll be a pride of hungry lions waiting to devour and rip those people apart. It's a brutal form of punishment. And yet the Persians were renowned for this sort of thing. It was the Persians who created hanging. It was the Persians who created crucifixion. When the records indicate that when Darius became king, when he overthrew the Babylonians, he got 3,000 Babylonians and impaled them on stakes. The Babylonians are known for these sorts of things. And here's Daniel, and he knows his background, and he knows the reputation of the Persians, and yet he hears the decree. And he knows the consequences if he doesn't obey it, and yet he will not stop worshipping his God. And so Daniel has a choice to make here because he wants to obey the king. He wants to be a good citizen. He's demonstrated that. But now they're asking him not to worship his God. And he's at this moment, he's got to decide which is lighter and what is heavier. Do I just worship the king for 30 days? Maybe I ought to just toe the line. Just pray privately for 30 days. After all, I've demonstrated my loyalty to God, my love of God. I already demonstrated that. I mean, look what I did in chapter 1 with the food, and chapters 2 and 4 and 5 around dreams and visions. I continually give the answers that God wants me to give. I continually give credit to God. I've been unashamed about that. Surely I've proven myself. And this thing about praying, whether I pray publicly in my window towards Jerusalem or whether I do it privately in my home, it's 30 days. Well, it's only a little thing. And so the question is, what would Daniel do? Will Daniel take a stand, or will he just be pragmatic about this particular situation? But is there any uncertainty about what Daniel will do? No. We know who Daniel is. Daniel is going to be consistent. He's going to do what he does every single day. He's not going to be a different person today than he was yesterday. And so Daniel decides he's going to pray. And yet this point of tension is something that we all face every single day. Sometimes it's these moments like, should I pray where other people can hear me or see me today? Or should I share my faith in this moment? Should I stand up for this cause? Or maybe I just be pragmatic, and maybe it won't matter if I let this go. Maybe I won't go to church today. Maybe I won't pray. Maybe I won't share my faith. Maybe I won't give God thanks for what he's just done. And sometimes we decide maybe in this moment what's heavier feels like my reputation or my comfort or my security or my preferences rather than God's. And Daniel's aware of this, and Daniel chooses God. Daniel's opponents know what sort of man Daniel is. And so verse 11 is not surprising. We're told, then these men went up as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. Of course they did. Of course they did. That's what you'd expect of Daniel. There's a consistency in Daniel around these sorts of things. Now, a couple of fascinating aspects about Daniel's prayer. When people would pray, when Jews would pray, you prayed morning and the afternoon, or morning and evening, twice a day. And when you pray, you normally stand. But we're given some details about Daniel's prayer, which is interesting. Daniel doesn't pray twice a day. He prays 3 times a day. And when he prays, he doesn't stand. He actually kneels. And we're also told he goes to an attic, which tells us something about him. In that culture, to have an attic like that, it means that you've got some wealth. So Daniel's successful. He's a man of means. He's thriving. He's doing well. And what he does is he goes up to his attic. He opens a window towards Jerusalem because that's where the temple is. He faces that, and 3 times a day he gets on his knees. It's a posture of humility. 3 times a day he says, I don't care what I've got or what I've achieved. I humbly come before my God. This is not the prayer of someone who is religious. This is the prayer of someone who is devoted to his God. And he cannot and will not stop doing this. And so when this moment comes, he humbly becomes before his God this day after the decree, as he does every single day. And it's his point of vulnerability. Because he has to make the choice. Am I going to follow humans or obey God? And so he decides, I'm going to obey God. I'm going to follow God rather than obey the decree. I'll choose God. And those who oppose him know this. They go to his house. They find him praying as they expect to do. And they report him to the king. And Daniel's fate, it seems, is sealed. Now, Daniel chapter 6 has a really interesting structure. And we've talked about this before. It's called a chiastic structure. And I mentioned this before. When we tell stories in the West, we tend to tell stories where the tensions are raised, and tension builds and builds and builds and builds until it's released sort of right towards the end of the story. In Hebrew writing, it's not uncommon to come across this chiastic structure where the tension sort of, if it's like a mountain, In the middle of the chapter is where the tension is resolved. We get the key point of the story in the middle of the story, and either side you've got the tension raised and tension answered at the start and then the end. And Daniel 6 falls in that sort of category. And so if you look at Daniel 6, it gives us a particular insight into what this is trying to tell us. Well, let's look at this structure. In verses 1 to 3, we get Daniel's success. And then by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we've got Daniel's success in verse 28. Verses 4 to 10, Darius signs a decree and Daniel takes a stand. By the end of the chapter, Darius signs a decree again, but he takes a stand this time. In verses 11 to 15, Daniel's colleagues try to kill him. And Daniel, in verse 24, spoiler alert, Daniel's colleagues meet their death. But right in the middle, we have this. This is the key point. Darius hopes for Daniel's deliverance, and then he's a witness to Daniel's deliverance. And what's interesting is not only is Daniel delivered, but the king wants him delivered. There is something about the quality of Daniel and Daniel's life that even though the king had to follow the edict, he does not want this. He, as much as anybody else in this story, he wants to see Daniel delivered. What is it about Daniel? It's his integrity. And so here's the king, and he finds himself trapped, and he has to give the order. Verses 16 to 18, so the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. You know what? I don't know if you've noticed this. If you've had an opportunity to read Daniel 6, not until verse 21 does Daniel speak. Everything revolves in this chapter is around what other people perceive of Daniel. When they look at the life of Daniel, what is it they see? When the king is confronted with this situation, what is the king's assessment of Daniel? May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. That's what he sees in Daniel. Even those who are against Daniel say, what are we going to do? He's trustworthy and he won't be corrupted and he's not negligent in his duties. The best we can do is maybe try to get him around something about his faith, because that's about the only thing. And so they see a person of faith. Daniel is a good man and Daniel has integrity, and he doesn't need to defend his life. That's the nature of integrity. When you live a life of integrity, you don't need to defend your life. You don't go at home at night thinking, what did I say? How can I explain that? Have I been caught out in some way? What you have is a life of peace. Daniel doesn't need to say anything. Everybody knows what Daniel's like. Daniel knows what he's like. Daniel knows he's ordered his life around God. He knows everybody. Everybody knows that. His life bears testimony to the fact that he believes that God is God over everything, even though he's in a pagan land, in a foreign country. He's this life that reflects his involvement of God in his life. And is littered throughout all of the opening chapters of Daniel. By the time I even remember the previous chapter, it was a different king who didn't even know Daniel. And when he's troubled by the writing on the wall, what happens? His wife pops up and says this about Daniel, chapter 5, verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. The queen in chapter 5 recognizes this, and even the new king under the new empire in chapter 6 recognizes this. And what happens is the king tries everything to save Daniel, but he can't. When the Persian law is made, that it is the law. It can't be repealed, it can't be revoked, it can't be changed in any way. And it seems like Daniel's fate is sealed. And the king does what he knows he has to do. But I think also at this point, the king knows he's being set up. I think the king realizes that that whole decree was never about worshipping him, it was about catching Daniel out. And so he goes home to his palace. He can't eat, he can't sleep, he's troubled. The king doesn't want to see this happen. He trusts Daniel, he likes Daniel. Daniel's a person of integrity, but what can the king do? So he obeys the law, he puts Daniel in the pit, and he goes to bed. And there is night, and then there is morning. Let me read for you what happens next. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. It's a fairly graphic end to the story in a way. But did you notice Daniel's first words? Verse 21 and 22, he says, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." It's what you'd expect Daniel to say, isn't it? It's absolute, there's consistency in Daniel. He's saying, "Oh king, you need to understand, I'm standing before you today. Why? Because my God took care of me." And what's his first concern is, I was fine. Before God, I hadn't done anything wrong. So that was my chief concern. Oh, and by the way, king, I hadn't done anything wrong to you either. Right? There's an integrity here. Daniel had been tested and tried, and he had stayed true. And what's the key to Daniel's integrity is he trusts God. He trusts God. I think all of us are going to struggle with integrity at times. All of us find it difficult to be completely consistent. You know, sometimes you can be a great prayer warrior and then you gossip. Sometimes you can unapologetically share your faith and then you lie. We all struggle with integrity. And what's Daniel's key? How does Daniel maintain a lifetime of this? I think it's this, that every day, it seems like the first thought of his morning and the last thought as his head hits a pillow at night is of God. He doesn't do the religious prayer. He does the prayer of devotion. 3 times a day he gets on his knees humbly before his God and he thanks God for everything. And I think if you want to live the life of integrity, it's got to start there. Do I come before God? Do I know God? Do I know Jesus? Do I really know him? See, Daniel knows God so thoroughly. He comes before him so regularly. He takes a posture of humility with his life. He's very clear about who he is and who God is. And it works its way through every nook and cranny of his life. You've got to know who God is if you want to live the life of integrity. But also, if you want to live a life of integrity, don't settle for authenticity alone. I remember when I first started ministry, I was at a small church and started preaching. And to be honest, the preaching in the church wasn't very, very good. And so what happened is I started to preach and I started to get all these attaboys and you're doing a great job. And I had a lot of kudos from it. And in fact, I started to feel pretty good about myself until I think it was the end of my second year of Bible college, I got a call to go to another church. There was a large church. So I went to the large church. And the preachers there were really, really good. And all of a sudden I realized that, hey, you're not so good. In fact, you've got a long way to go. And see, if you want to grow into the life of integrity, if you want to improve and become who God wants you to be, then if you have like a low point of comparison, low expectation, you'll end up with a really high opinion of yourself. But if you have a higher point of comparison, if you look to something greater and better, that'll be the catalyst for you to grow. A life of authenticity just says, look, it looks at me and just says, I'm just being real to who I am. A life of integrity says, who am I becoming? Who does God want me to be? Am I truly someone who reflects the image of God? Am I someone who is living the life that God wants me to live? Am I being all that I could be? Life of integrity, the journey towards integrity is saying that, hey, what sort of man or what sort of woman do I want to be? I want you to take a moment, just imagine the kind of person you could be. If you're going to pursue a life of integrity, imagine a version of you that is more like Christ. That's maybe a little more humble, maybe more generous, a little kinder, a little more courageous, a little more other-focused. Imagine a you that when people look at your life, you unapologetically declare that you follow God and that you know God. That's a life to pursue. That's a life of becoming the person of integrity. And see, a life of integrity doesn't just happen. You can live a life of authenticity and not change a thing about yourself. It's about being true to your spirit or your character or your bent. But a life of integrity where you focus unapologetically on God and you have rhythms in your life where you say, I want to know you and know you deeply. A life where you say, I'm not going to just be satisfied with where I am. I want to be someone who is better, someone who is more like Christ, someone who is kinder and gentler and courageous and generous and compassionate. I want to be that version of me. That is a life of integrity. And that's a life Daniel lived, and that's a life that got the attention of the king and of the nations and even his enemies. And that's a life that God invites us to live. Don't be satisfied with authenticity. Pursue integrity. Let me pray. Father, as we go into this week, I ask that you stir a discontent in us, Father, that help us to be honest and real, but never to be false. To be honest enough to say that we want to be like Christ and we want to live lives that are reflected, that we are created in the image of God. We want to live lives that honor the one that we follow. Lives that are marked unapologetically by the touch of God on our lives, by the touch of you on our lives. Where the Holy Spirit is doing his work in us, where we're becoming kinder and gentler and more courageous and more compassionate. Have our lives to be marked by these things. And help us to do the work of getting on our knees every day and humbly coming before our God in gratitude. Help us do the work of getting to know Christ more and more. Help us do the work of spending time in your word. Help us do the work of being open to the counsel of others as they help us grow and improve. And so that we more and more will not just be authentic, but we will be people of integrity. In Jesus' name we pray.